The judge asked my husband one question, and the confidence on his side of the courtroom began to crack. Mr. Ellison, why did you cancel Owen's cardiology appointment 11 days before his heart stopped? Grant's attorney came to his feet, knocking his chair against the wooden rail. Your Honor, that wording is prejudicial. The child suffered a cardiac event and was successfully resuscitated. Judge Elena Hart glanced at the medical summary on her bench. The emergency physician wrote cardiac arrest. I am using the physician's words. The attorney returned to his seat. Grant still wore his wedding ring, even though he had filed for divorce 3 months earlier. His hands rested on a yellow legal pad, one thumb pressed so hard against the paper that the nail had turned white. His mother sat directly behind him. Vivian Ellison wore a cream-colored suit, pearl earrings, and the solemn expression she reserved for occasions when she wanted cruelty to resemble concern. She had remained composed while their attorney called me controlling. She barely reacted when he suggested my years as an Air Force critical care nurse had left me unable to distinguish ordinary anxiety from medical danger. Then he summarized 8 years of raising Owen with the phrase Vivian had used from the beginning. I was only his aunt. Grant finally answered the judge. I don't remember canceling it. A hospital access report lay open beside my attorney's hand. The appointment had been removed through Grant's authorized account at 9:14 on a Sunday night. The login came from our home network. 5 minutes later, the same account added a note stating that Owen's dizziness had resolved and the family no longer wanted a specialist evaluation. Neither statement was true. Judge Hart leaned forward. Are you saying someone else used your account? I'm saying Mara and I lived in the same house. We both had access to the family computer. My attorney, Claire Donnelly, turned one page but did not interrupt. Grant continued. I may have logged in. I may have moved the appointment. There were several conversations happening at once. You never rescheduled it. I intended to. Did you know Owen had become dizzy during exercise? Yes. Did you know his mother died following a cardiac collapse? Grant looked toward Vivian before answering. We were never given a definite explanation for Lydia's death. His mother lowered her eyes, but her thumb began moving over the brass clasp of her purse. I had seen that habit before. Vivian did it when she feared the next question more than the one she had already answered. Claire opened a gray folder containing a genetic report Grant and Vivian had spent years describing as uncertain, incomplete, or lost. The canceled appointment was not the only issue before the court. Money had disappeared from Owen's survivor trust. My electronic signature appeared on requests I had never approved. Grant had submitted selected pages from my military health records, while withholding the pages documenting my recovery and return to full duty. Most painful of all, Owen had been taught that caring about me meant betraying the mother he lost. Judge Hart looked in my direction. Major Ellison, do you believe your husband intentionally placed this child in danger? Owen was waiting in another room with Naomi Brooks, the advocate appointed by the court to protect his interests. He was 15 years old. In less than 4 months, he had survived cardiac arrest, lost the sport he loved, and listened to adults debate whether the woman who raised him had ever counted as family. The last time I saw him before he collapsed, he had looked down at the table and said, "You're not my mother, Mara. You're just my aunt." The words did not sound like his. They sounded memorized. I turned back to the judge. I believe Grant had enough information to stop and ask for help, I said. He chose an easier answer. His attorney rose again. That is speculation. Judge Hart made a note. Then the evidence will have to tell us whether she is right. Vivian's thumb stopped moving. People often imagine that a case changes when one perfect document enters the room. Ours did not. For months, every fact seemed to come with an explanation Grant's attorney could use. A canceled appointment could be called a mistake. A false medical form could be called carelessness. Missing money could be presented as a desperate loan. Even Owen's collapse did not immediately settle the question of who should raise him. At one point, the strongest document in Grant's possession appeared to prove that I had planned to take full control of Owen long before the emergency. If the hearing had happened a few weeks earlier, I might have lost. To understand why, you have to go back 8 years, to the night Grant's younger sister died. My name is Mara Ellison. I was 47 when my husband tried to remove me from our nephew's life. I spent 21 years in the United States Air Force. Most of that time was in critical care and aeromedical evacuation. Working inside military aircraft taught me to watch what other people dismissed. Panic did not always arrive as screaming. Sometimes it appeared as a patient answering half a second too slowly, a monitor changing rhythm, or a medic reaching toward the wrong syringe. I became careful because people depended on it. After retirement, I put my medals in a cedar box and stored it at the back of a closet. I wanted the next part of my life to feel ordinary. Grant seemed to want the same thing. We met at a medical technology conference in San Antonio. He sold orthopedic equipment to hospitals and rehabilitation centers. He remembered names, sent thank you notes, and made nervous people feel as though every problem could be handled. He also called Vivian every Sunday evening. At the time, I thought it showed devotion. Later, I understood that Grant had never learned to disappoint his mother without feeling like a disloyal son. His younger sister, Lydia, had learned. She challenged Vivian openly, walked out of family dinners when the insults became too sharp, and refused to apologize for asking uncomfortable questions. Lydia was raising her son Owen alone when she began having fainting spells. Doctors blamed anxiety, dehydration, and exhaustion. She once told me, "When a young woman says something is wrong, everyone wants to know what she's worried about before they ask what her body is doing." 2 years later, Lydia collapsed in a grocery store parking lot. She died before Owen reached the hospital. He was 7. Grant sat beside him on our living room sofa, but could not form the words. I knelt in front of Owen and told him his mother was gone. He did not cry immediately. Instead, he asked, "Who is going to know what I need now?" Grant and I became his legal guardians. His father had already disappeared from his life and did not contest the arrangement. Owen moved into the bedroom at the end of our hallway. For several weeks, he slept with the light on. Later, he turned it off but left the door open. Some nights he stood beside my bed until I woke. He never woke Grant. He came to me. Once, he asked whether laughing at school meant he was forgetting Lydia. I told him happiness did not erase love. For several years, our home felt stable. Grant taught him to fish and play football. I handled school meetings, therapy appointments, and the routines that made his days predictable. Vivian thanked me at first. Then her gratitude became correction. Lydia never made him finish food he didn't like. A few months later, when I enrolled Owen in grief counseling, she went further. My daughter would not have wanted him raised to think something was wrong with him. I told her counseling was not a diagnosis. She leaned toward me. "Court papers can make you responsible. They cannot make you his mother." Grant heard the exchange from the kitchen. That evening, I asked him why he said nothing. "She's grieving. So is Owen. Mom means well." The same sentence ended dozens of conversations over the next several years. When Owen complained about a rule, Grant became the easy adult, and I became the obstacle. Vivian added meaning to the division. "A uniform taught Mara how to give orders," she once told him. "It didn't teach her how to raise a child." Grant changed the subject. He always changed the subject. Meanwhile, his income began falling. His employer lost a major hospital account, and Grant invested in a small medical supply venture with 2 former colleagues. He promised me our household finances were protected. I believed him. He borrowed from Vivian, opened credit cards I did not know about, and continued telling Owen that everything was fine. The business slowly consumed whatever Grant gave it. Vivian started buying Owen expensive gifts and making comments about the freedom he would have if Grant alone made the rules. At church, she introduced him as the last piece of Lydia. In family photographs, Grant and Owen stood near the center. Vivian arranged herself beside them. I usually ended up at the edge. I noticed. I said nothing. Speaking up would have allowed Vivian to accuse me of competing with a dead woman, and I did not want Owen trapped inside that argument. My silence kept the room calm. It also gave her years to define me for him. The first serious warning came when Owen was 14. His school nurse called after he became dizzy during physical education and grabbed a fence to keep from falling. By the time I arrived, he was embarrassed. I stood up too fast. "You were running," the nurse reminded him. His pulse was rapid, and his skin felt cool. I took him to his pediatrician. The examination was mostly normal, but an electrocardiogram showed a possible electrical abnormality. It was not a diagnosis. The doctor referred him to a pediatric cardiologist because the dizziness occurred during exercise and Lydia had died young. The appointment was scheduled for November 18th. 4 days before it, the appointment vanished from the hospital system. The clinic said an authorized family user had canceled it. Grant and I were the only people with access. When I asked him, he continued typing on his laptop. I moved it. To when? Mom found a sports doctor who can see him sooner. He was referred to cardiology. He wants to play football, Mara. A sports doctor understands athletes. That is not the same kind of evaluation. Grant shut the laptop. You're frightening him. He nearly fainted while running. He skips breakfast and forgets to drink water. His mother died after collapsing. He needs a normal life. Vivian arrived 20 minutes later, carrying a casserole Grant had not mentioned asking for. She spoke while Owen stood in the doorway. You spent your career preparing for disasters, she said. He should not have to live as though one is always coming. This is a referral from his doctor. One doctor's opinion. After an abnormal screening. Lydia hated being turned into a patient. Vivian looked directly at Owen. If people keep telling a child his body is dangerous, eventually he becomes afraid to live in it. He did not answer, but he looked at me differently. I should have called the cardiology clinic myself the next morning. Instead, I trusted Grant when he said he would reschedule after the sports consultation. The sports physician cleared Owen for limited activity, using a medical history form completed by Grant. Months later, I learned that Grant had denied 3 things on that form: Owen's dizziness during exercise, the pending cardiology referral, and a family history of sudden cardiac death. Around the same time, the bank managing Owen's survivor trust called me. Lydia's life insurance and a small employment settlement had created the account. Grant and I were co-trustees, so major withdrawals required both approvals. A bank representative wanted to verify a reimbursement of nearly $10,000 for private academic support. Owen attended public school. He did not have a tutor. The request carried Grant's signature and an imitation of mine. I asked for the full account history, expecting one suspicious transaction. More than $42,000 had quietly left the trust over 18 months. I was still staring at the figure when Owen's school called. Someone had removed me from his emergency contact list. I had not approved it. I had not even known a change had been requested. For a moment, I was no longer standing in my kitchen. I was back in the hospital after Lydia died, listening as a social worker asked Owen whom he wanted contacted, if he woke frightened or became sick. He pointed at me. Now someone was erasing that choice from the places where it mattered. I confronted Grant that evening. The trust statements lay across the dining table. He looked at the first page and said, I was going to replace it. You used my signature. The bank stored it electronically. You attached it to expenses Owen never had. I borrowed money. From a child. I have supported him for 8 years. So have I. Grant stood and walked toward the window. You have no idea what kind of pressure I've been under. I understand what the account shows. That is always your answer. Accounts, schedules, records. Everything has to be managed. The money did not belong to you. He turned back. If you use the word theft in court, Mara, they will examine you too. 3 days later, I received divorce papers and an emergency request to terminate my guardianship. Grant described me as an unstable veteran, suffering from untreated combat trauma. He claimed I exaggerated Owen's symptoms, monitored his communication, restricted his activities, and used the trust to make him financially dependent. The filing also stated that I had confused being an aunt with being a mother because I had never been able to have children of my own. Only a handful of people knew the details of my infertility. Vivian knew. Grant attached selected pages from my military health file. They mentioned temporary insomnia after deployment, counseling, and a short restriction from night duty. The records showing successful treatment and full return to duty were missing. Vivian's statement was more polished. She had observed increasing hypervigilance. Owen appeared fearful of disappointing Mara. I seemed emotionally invested in discovering illness. She described herself several times as his biological grandmother. I appeared once as aunt by marriage. Nothing in her statement sounded openly hateful. Concern was more effective. At the emergency hearing, Grant's attorney argued that Owen needed temporary stability while the allegations were reviewed. Judge Hart allowed him to stay with Grant. My visits became supervised. I temporarily lost the right to make medical decisions. Vivian moved into Grant's rental house, replaced Owen's phone, and changed the passwords. At our first supervised visit, Owen sat across from me, in a family services room, and stared at the table. I asked about school. Fine. I asked whether he had felt dizzy again. Uncle Grant says I shouldn't talk to you about health things. I'm not asking you to choose sides. You always think something is wrong. I think the doctor's referral should be completed. Grandma says you need me to be sick. The woman supervising the visit stopped writing. I folded my hands. Do you believe that? I don't know. Then he repeated the sentence Vivian had built around my infertility. She says if I grow up and leave, you'll have nobody. I wanted to defend every year we had shared. I wanted to list the nights I stayed awake, the meetings I attended, the promises I kept. Instead, I said, you do not owe me your childhood. Uncle Grant says his house is my real home now. You're allowed to feel safe there. You're not my mother. I know. You're just my aunt. His eyes remained on the table. Lydia was your mother, I said. Loving me never required replacing her. When the visit ended, I sat in my car until the parking lot lights came on. A folder containing the trust statements rested on the passenger seat. I reached for it twice and stopped. For the first time, I wondered whether fighting for Owen might feel to him like fighting against him. Then I remembered the false signature, the canceled specialist, and the school record. Whatever Grant was hiding had moved beyond a damaged marriage. Before I could uncover it, Owen collapsed during football practice. His coach later told me Owen slowed during a drill, placed one hand against his chest, and fell. The athletic trainer began CPR. Paramedics shocked his heart before taking him to the hospital. I learned about it from a school secretary who found my name in an older emergency file. Grant had not called. At the ICU entrance, Vivian blocked my path. You are not authorized. My nephew is inside. My grandson is receiving care. I may have information his doctors need. You've done enough. Her hands shook, but her voice remained cold. You filled his head with fear. You made him believe his heart was weak. His heart stopped. Stress can do terrible things. Move. She stayed where she was. Grant appeared behind the glass doors, wearing a visitor badge. Did you tell them how Lydia died? I asked. He looked away. A nurse came out and asked us to lower our voices. I explained the referral and Lydia's unexplained collapse. Vivian interrupted. She is not family. The nurse studied both of us. Was the patient's mother diagnosed with an inherited heart rhythm condition? Grant's face changed. Vivian grabbed his arm. Neither of them asked what the nurse meant. You knew, I said. Grant shook his head, but Vivian spoke over him. It was never conclusive. The ICU doors closed between us. I did not know what report the nurse had seen, whether it still existed, or whether Grant had ever read it. All I had was Vivian's reaction. That would not be enough in court. Colonel Leah Morgan joined me at the hospital shortly after midnight. Leah was a cardiologist and former Air Force flight surgeon. We had served together for 6 years. She sat beside me near a vending machine and handed me coffee. What do we actually know? The question steadied me. I described the dizziness, the canceled specialist, the sports clearance, the missing trust money, and the nurse's reference to an inherited condition. Leah wrote a few categories on a napkin: medical sequence, independent witnesses, family history, financial motive. Do you think the trust connects to the medical issue? I asked. If removing you gives Grant control over the money and the medical story, I wouldn't assume the two conflicts are separate. She told me to avoid public accusations and emotional messages. Find out what happened first. Motive can wait. The following morning, Naomi Brooks arrived. She was Owen's court-appointed advocate. Her job was to recommend what protected him, not what felt fair to me or Grant. Naomi asked why I had not restored the cardiology appointment myself. I trusted Grant when I should have verified. You believed the referral was important. Yes. You had the authority to call the clinic. Yes. Then you also made a decision that left the appointment incomplete. I did. She watched me carefully. Do you believe Grant loves Owen? Yes. Vivian? Yes. Then why would they ignore a serious medical concern? I thought about Grant buying football equipment, Vivian holding Lydia's sweater after the funeral, and Owen smiling between them in family photographs. Because loving someone does not guarantee that you will choose the truth when the truth threatens the role you want to play. Before leaving, Naomi told me Owen was awake but did not want to see me. Then she added, he asked whether collapsing meant he had proved you right. This cannot become a contest. I told him the same thing. For the next several weeks, we found evidence, but almost every discovery created another argument. The school nurse located earlier reports describing dizziness and fatigue during physical activity. One incident occurred while I was out of state. That weakened Grant's claim that I created the symptoms. It did not prove he understood their significance. The football coach gave us messages, showing he had asked Grant whether Owen completed the cardiology evaluation. Grant replied that Owen had been medically cleared. Grant's attorney argued that he reasonably relied on the sports physician. The sports physician admitted he would not have cleared Owen if he had known the full history, but he could not say whether Grant deliberately lied or simply misunderstood the questions. Then the hospital confirmed that Grant's account canceled the appointment and added the false note saying Owen's symptoms had resolved. Claire read the access summary on her computer. The account belongs to him. The login came from your house. He already admitted moving the appointment. He did not admit writing the note. Who else would do it? Claire closed the screen. A family court judge will ask the same question. Suspicion is not the same as proof. We asked Judge Hart to restore my medical authority immediately. She refused. Owen had just survived cardiac arrest, she said, and another abrupt change could increase his distress before the investigation was complete. He remained with Grant. I had expected the hospital record to change everything. Instead, Grant told Owen that I was using the emergency to win the case. The next blow came from an email I had written. Grant's attorney found it during the exchange of documents. I had sent the message to Leah 2 weeks before Owen collapsed. The subject line was, "If Grant refuses again." One paragraph read, "If he keeps blocking the cardiology referral, I may have no choice but to seek sole medical authority. Owen cannot be safe, while every decision becomes a contest between evidence and what Grant wants to believe." Grant's attorney submitted the paragraph to the court. Vivian shared its existence with relatives. The story changed overnight. I was no longer a guardian who responded to danger. I was a woman who had already planned to take control. Naomi asked me about it during our next meeting. "You wrote that you might seek sole authority." "Yes." "Before the collapse." "Yes." "Why did you not disclose the email earlier?" "No one asked for my private messages with Leah." Grant's attorney says, "It shows you were building a guardianship case." "I was asking a cardiologist what options existed if he kept refusing the referral." "Did you want sole control?" "I wanted the appointment completed." "That is not the same answer." She was right. I sat back. If a judge had given me temporary authority to complete the evaluation, I would have accepted it. Naomi made a note. The following week, her preliminary report included a sentence that terrified me. Major Ellison's concern appears medically grounded. However, her communications indicate that she considered expanding her authority before the acute event. Grant's attorney finally had something that did not require Vivian's interpretation. My own words appeared to support their accusation. The full email thread told a more complicated story. Leah had replied, "Do not begin with court. Send Grant the referral, the ECG summary, and a written request to reschedule. Make clear that you want a joint decision. If he refuses after receiving the information, then talk to counsel about temporary medical authority, limited to the evaluation." My answer was, "That is what I want. I don't want to remove him. I want him to stop treating this like a contest he has to win." Claire wanted to introduce the whole exchange immediately. I asked her to wait. "Why?" she said. "Because it still shows I thought about going to court. You thought about protecting a child through lawful means. It also shows Naomi was right. I did not trust Grant. Should you have?" The question had no easy answer. At that point in the story, the audience in the courtroom would not know either. Grant had ignored warning signs. I had considered removing his authority. Owen continued telling Naomi he wanted to live with Grant because Grant made him feel normal. The full military records arrived soon afterward. They showed temporary insomnia following deployment, voluntary counseling, successful recovery, and return to full duty. The documents defeated the claim that I suffered from an untreated disorder. Grant's attorney adjusted. He stopped describing me as mentally ill and began describing me as rigid. He pointed to my schedules, my notes, and the email about sole authority. A person did not need to be unstable, he argued, to create a home where a teenager felt constantly monitored. Naomi's interviews gave the argument weight. Owen told her that I checked where he was, asked about his symptoms, and wanted to know when he skipped meals. All of those things were true. He also said Grant made him feel trusted. If the hearing had occurred then, the result might have favored Grant. The financial investigation did not settle it. The bank confirmed that Owen's trust had been used to cover Grant's failed business. Fake educational expenses had been submitted, and my electronic signature had been inserted. Grant admitted taking the money. He called it borrowing. His attorney described it as a desperate attempt to preserve the income supporting Owen's home. Illegal conduct did not automatically determine where a 15-year-old felt safest. Vivian claimed the $11,000 she received was repayment for a personal loan. She said Grant never told her the money came from the trust. Claire believed she was lying. Belief did not establish knowledge. Then Vivian left me a voicemail. Her message began in the measured tone she used at church. "Mara, this has gone far enough. Owen needs peace." A moment later, the performance slipped. "You were useful when Lydia died, but usefulness does not make you his mother. A woman with your history sees danger because she needs danger. Once Grant has sole control, Owen can stop living like a patient." She paused. "And the trust can finally be used by this family, instead of being frozen by someone who never truly belonged to it." Claire listened twice. "It establishes hostility and financial motive. Does it prove she knew about the withdrawals? No. Does it prove Grant knew the medical risk? No. It sounds terrible. It is terrible. Terrible and decisive are not always the same thing. Even my own attorney refused to promise an outcome. The hospital system initially reported that Lydia's genetic file could not be located. The hospital had merged twice since her death, and older counseling attachments were stored separately from the main medical chart. Grant's attorney asked the court to prevent us from referring to an inherited diagnosis without an authenticated report. Judge Hart agreed. The nurse's question in the ICU was not evidence. Vivian's statement that the diagnosis was inconclusive was not enough. Without the file, Grant could argue he had known only that Lydia's death involved a possible heart problem. Then his legal team found an expert. Dr. Peter Lang reviewed the information Grant claimed to possess before Owen collapsed. In a recorded deposition, he explained that teenage dizziness could have several causes, and that screening ECGs sometimes produced unclear results. Would a non-medical guardian be unreasonable to rely on a sports physician's clearance? Grant's attorney asked. Not necessarily. Claire asked the next question. Would your opinion change if the guardian knew the child's mother carried a confirmed genetic heart rhythm condition? Of course. If the mother personally warned him to test the child after dizziness during exercise. Yes, but without those facts, the decision is less clear. Vivian began telling relatives that an independent specialist had proved I overreacted. Grant offered a settlement. He would repay the trust over time. I would retain supervised access to Owen and participate in major decisions, but Grant would remain the primary guardian. Owen could choose where he lived. The agreement sat on my kitchen table until after midnight. Accepting it might end the legal war. Rejecting it might convince Owen that Vivian had been right about me wanting control. I called Claire. What if he genuinely wants Grant? He may. Then am I protecting him or refusing to listen? You're asking the wrong question. What is the right one? Did he receive enough truthful information to make that choice freely? I looked at the empty hallway. Do we have enough to prove he didn't? Not yet. 11 days before the final hearing, Claire called me to her office. The hospital had recovered Lydia's genetic counseling file from an older system. The report confirmed that she carried a genetic variant associated with congenital long QT syndrome, an electrical problem that could trigger fainting, dangerous heart rhythms, or cardiac arrest. It recommended evaluation for Owen. The report had been electronically delivered to both Grant and Vivian 7 years earlier. Grant's account showed that he opened and downloaded it. Claire did not celebrate. He will say he received a technical document during a traumatic period and did not understand it. Leah joined us and reviewed the report. She agreed that much of the language was complex. Then she found an attached message Lydia had sent Grant 2 months before her death. Grant, I know Mom thinks testing will make everyone afraid. If Owen ever faints, gets dizzy during sports, or says his heart feels wrong, please have him checked. Don't teach him that ignoring his body makes him strong, Grant had replied beneath it. I promise, I will. The room became very quiet. For years, I had pictured Lydia's final months through stories other people told me. Now her own words sat in front of us. She knew Vivian preferred denial. She knew Grant wanted to appear reassuring. And she had named the exact symptom that later appeared. I read Grant's reply again. 4 ordinary words. words he had once intended Lydia to trust. Claire placed the message beside the genetic report. The report proves delivery, this proves understanding. Even then, Grant had one possible defense. 7 years had passed. He could claim that grief and time blurred the details. Then Claire's subpoena of Vivian's email account produced a message sent 2 days before Grant filed for divorce. Remove Mara as trustee first. Once the court recognizes she is unstable, the bank will release the funds to the actual family. Do not discuss Lydia's report unless they locate it independently. Vivian had not written that the report was confusing. She had instructed Grant to hide it. The email also showed that the trust and the medical secret were part of the same plan. Still, the guardianship question depended on Owen. Naomi interviewed him again after doctors confirmed his diagnosis and told him football was no longer safe. She asked why he had been so certain he wanted to remain with Grant. Owen said Grant told him, "I planned to send him to a residential medical program." No such program had ever been discussed. Vivian told him I would use his trust to keep him from driving, leaving home, or attending college far away. They gave him a future to fear. Naomi also asked what happened after he regained consciousness in the hospital. Owen said Grant leaned close to his bed and told him not to mention the earlier dizzy spells. Why? Naomi asked. Because the doctors might say Mara was right. Did he mention your health? He said if Mara used this against him, I might never get to come home. Grant had asked a child recovering from cardiac arrest to protect his legal position. Naomi still did not immediately recommend that Owen return to me. He felt betrayed by Grant, but feared I hated him. 3 weeks after the collapse, she arranged a private visit between us. Owen sat in a hospital conference room, wearing a loose gray sweatshirt. His hand rested near the healing incision below his collarbone. Neither of us knew how to begin. Finally, he asked, "Did you know I had it?" "No. But you thought something was wrong. I thought you needed the specialist." His eyes filled. "I told everyone you wanted me sick." "I know. Were you angry?" "Yes." He looked toward the window. "Grandma said sick kids don't leave the people who take care of them." "Did you believe her?" "I wanted to." "Why?" "Because if you weren't controlling me, then Uncle Grant lied." I moved my chair closer, but left enough distance for him to decide what happened next. "I'm not asking you to understand everything today. Are you going to leave?" "No. Even after what I said." "You were trying to make sense of adults you trusted." "I still said it." "You did." His face folded in a way I had not seen since Lydia died. "Was I bad?" "No." He leaned toward me. I put my arms around him. "You were never bad." He cried against my shoulder. When the meeting ended, he did not say where he wanted to live. He asked only one question. "Is my room still there?" "Yes." That was all I carried into court. Not a promise, not a victory. A question about a bedroom. At the final hearing, Grant's attorney began by using my own email against me. He displayed the subject line on a large screen. "If Grant refuses again." "Major Ellison, you wrote this before Owen's collapse?" "Yes." "You said you might seek sole medical authority?" "Yes." "You were already considering removing my client as a decision-maker." "I was considering temporary authority to complete the cardiology evaluation." "That limitation does not appear in the paragraph on the screen." "No. It appears in the rest of the conversation." Claire introduced Leah's reply and my final message. The judge read both. Grant's attorney did not abandon the point. "You could have called the clinic yourself." "Yes." "You believed the referral mattered." "Yes." "But you allowed it to remain cancelled." "I trusted Grant when I should have verified." "So you also failed Owen." The question remained between us. I could have explained. Instead, I said, yes. Grant's side of the courtroom seemed to relax. The admission gave them what they needed. Proof that I was not the flawless protector my attorney wanted the judge to see. Judge Hart looked at me. What changed after that mistake? I stopped assuming that a person's reassurance was equal to information. And what would you do differently now? I would call the specialist before finishing the argument. The judge made a note. Vivian testified next. She did not answer Claire's questions with simple yes or no replies. She told stories. When Claire asked about the $11,000, Vivian described Grant's failing business, his responsibility to support Owen, and the loans she made to preserve the household. You understood the money came from Owen's trust? Claire asked. I understood my son was trying to keep a roof over his family. That was not the question. Families share burdens. Did Owen authorize his inheritance to rescue Grant's business? He was 14. Exactly. Vivian turned slightly toward the judge. My son made mistakes. Mara turned those mistakes into a campaign to take a child from the only blood family he had left. Claire allowed the words to settle. Then she played the voicemail. Vivian listened to herself call me useful, deny that I belonged, and discuss gaining access to the trust after my removal. Her explanation came quickly. I was angry. Mara had frozen funds that could have supported Owen. The funds had been used for false expenses. I did not prepare those forms. Claire displayed the email sent before the divorce filing. Remove her as trustee first. Once the court recognizes she is unstable, the bank will release the funds to the actual family. Do not discuss Lydia's report unless they locate it independently. Vivian stared at the screen. What did you mean by actual family? Claire asked. My son and grandson. Not Mara. She is related through marriage. What did you mean by Lydia's report? Vivian inhaled slowly. My daughter received a great deal of frightening information near the end of her life. I did not want Mara turning one uncertain document into Owen's identity. You knew the document recommended testing. I knew it contained possibilities. You told Grant not to discuss it. I advised him not to feed Mara's fixation. Her answer did not crumble into a confession. It revealed something colder. Vivian believed hiding the information was justified because she had already decided I could not be trusted with it. Judge Hart addressed her directly. Owen's pediatrician independently issued a cardiology referral. Was that physician also fixated? Vivian adjusted the sleeve of her jacket. I believed Grant should make the decision. For the first time, she placed the full responsibility on her son. Grant shifted in his chair and looked back at her. The school reports, coach's messages, sports form, and hospital access history were presented together. They established a simple sequence. Owen became dizzy more than once. His doctor ordered further evaluation. Grant denied the history to the sports physician. His account canceled the cardiology appointment. Dr. Lang, Grant's expert, testified next. He explained that dizziness in teenagers often had harmless causes and that the sports clearance might have reassured an ordinary parent. For several minutes, Grant's choice sounded careless rather than deliberate. Claire waited until he finished. Would you have cleared Owen if you knew his mother carried a confirmed long QT variant? No. If you knew she personally warned Grant to arrange testing after exertional dizziness? No. Would hiding those facts be medically reasonable? No. Leah followed. Grant's attorney asked whether anxiety could produce dizziness. It can. And Mara's repeated concern, could have increased Owen's anxiety? It is possible. The attorney paused, allowing the answer to help him. Leah continued before he sat down. Anxiety can make a child dizzy. It did not produce the life-threatening rhythm recorded when Owen collapsed. The courtroom quieted again. My complete military health file came next. It showed treatment, recovery, and return to unrestricted duty. Judge Hart asked Grant who selected the pages used in his original petition. My attorney's office assembled the filing. His attorney stood. We used the records Mr. Ellison provided. Grant tried to clarify. I gave them what I had. You possessed the full file? The judge asked. I had access to it, but submitted only the pages describing symptoms. I did not think the later pages were relevant. You asked the court to evaluate her current fitness. Grant began explaining that he relied on legal advice. The more he spoke, the less direct he became. He described stress, rushed preparation, and concern for Owen. Judge Hart waited until he finished. Did you provide the complete record? No. Claire opened Lydia's recovered medical file. The genetic report was admitted first. Grant's attorney repeated that downloading a technical document did not prove comprehension. Judge Hart agreed. Then Claire displayed Lydia's message. Grant, I know Mom thinks testing will make everyone afraid. If Owen ever faints, gets dizzy during sports, or says his heart feels wrong, please have him checked. Grant's reply appeared beneath it. I promise. I will. Claire walked toward him. Did you write those words? Yes. Did you understand what your sister was asking? At the time, yes. Did Owen later become dizzy during sports? Yes. Did you tell the sports physician about Lydia's warning? No. Did you cancel the cardiology appointment? I moved it. You never obtained a new date? No. Why? Grant did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, the courtroom voice he had practiced was gone. Owen had already lost so much. football was the first thing that made him feel strong. Every time Mara talked about doctors, I saw him becoming scared. So you decided the risk was not real? I decided we had time. You denied the family history on his sports form. I thought Lydia's death was complicated. She told you what to do if this exact symptom appeared. My mother said the report had never been certain. Claire looked toward Vivian. Grant followed her eyes. For years, he had used his mother's confidence as permission. Now Vivian sat perfectly still, leaving him to carry the answer alone. Claire asked one final question. After Owen collapsed, did you tell him not to mention the earlier symptoms? I told him not to let Mara turn the hospital into another legal fight. He had just been resuscitated. I was trying to calm him. You were asking him to protect you. No, I was trying to keep our family together. The words did more damage than a confession. Grant still believed the image of the family deserved protection from the truth. Naomi testified last. She explained that Owen initially wanted to stay with Grant. He associated Mr. Ellison with normalcy and Major Ellison with restriction, she said. That preference was real, even though it was shaped by incomplete information. She described the false stories about residential treatment, driving, and college. Then she told the judge what Grant said in the ICU. Owen believed that discussing his earlier symptoms could help Major Ellison win and prevent him from returning home. Grant's attorney asked whether Owen might have misunderstood a frightened adult. Any child can misunderstand an adult, Naomi replied. The concern is that Owen repeatedly described being made responsible for the consequences of this case. Does he now wish to live with Major Ellison? Naomi hesitated. Vivian leaned forward. He struggled with the question, Naomi said. He did not want choosing one guardian to become an act of betrayal against the other. Did he reach a decision? He prepared a written statement. Vivian spoke before the judge could respond. That boy has been coached. Judge Hart looked directly at her. You will not interrupt again. Naomi unfolded a page Owen had creased through the center. She began reading. I said Mara was just my aunt because Grandma said real family doesn't need paperwork. But Uncle Grant used paperwork to take her away, and Mara used it to prove something was wrong with my heart. I was angry at Mara because she made me feel different. Now I know she was trying to keep me alive. Grant closed his eyes. Naomi continued. I am angry at Uncle Grant because he wanted me to feel normal more than he wanted to tell me the truth. I still love him. I just don't trust him to decide what I need right now. I don't know what to call Mara. I only know she came every time I needed her, even after I told her not to. I want to go back to my room at her house. I also don't want Grandma speaking for my mother anymore. The last sentence changed Vivian's face more than the financial records or the genetic report. Owen had rejected the authority she built from Lydia's death. He was not choosing me as a replacement mother. He was choosing a home where he believed adults would tell him the truth. Judge Hart removed her glasses. Blood relationship can explain why people feel entitled to speak, she said. It does not make their decisions safe. She looked toward me. Major Ellison acknowledged that she should have restored the appointment herself. Her willingness to accept that failure weighs heavily in her favor. Then she turned to Grant. You received a direct warning from the child's mother, concealed relevant history from a physician, and later asked the child to view medical truth as a weapon in this litigation. Grant stared down at the yellow legal pad. Judge Hart faced Vivian last. You treated Lydia's memory as authority you could exercise on her behalf. Owen has now asked you to stop. The hearing recessed. When the judge returned, she denied Grant's request to terminate my guardianship. The temporary restrictions against me were dissolved. I received primary physical custody and temporary authority over Owen's medical decisions. Grant would have supervised visits until he completed a psychological evaluation, medical safety education, and family therapy. He was removed from control of the trust. A professional trustee would manage the remaining money. The suspicious withdrawals were referred for further investigation. Vivian was barred from unsupervised contact and ordered not to discuss my mental health, the case, or Lydia's supposed wishes with Owen. After the ruling, Grant approached my table. Mara, I looked at him. I never wanted him hurt. I know. He appeared surprised. Understanding that he did not want the outcome did not erase the choices that produced it. The business was failing, he said. Mom said if you became the only stable parent, I would lose him. So you gave him a reason to fear me. I thought I could replace the money. You forged my signature. I panicked. I can understand panic, Grant. What I cannot understand is asking Owen to lie after his heart stopped. His face tightened. I wanted him to come home. He needed to know he was safe. Vivian was being guided toward the hallway when she turned toward me. You destroyed this family. I watched her leave without answering. 2 days later, Naomi brought Owen home. He stood in the doorway with a duffel bag and the gray blanket he had kept since childhood. His room remained the same. On the whiteboard beside his desk, I had written his medication schedule, follow-up appointment, school meeting, and emergency numbers. He studied the list. Still doing this? Always. Grandma said lists were how you controlled people. They helped me remember what matters. He placed the duffel bag on the floor. That evening, we ate soup at the kitchen table. Before bed, Owen paused in the hallway. Do I have to call you something different now? No. Not Mom? No. Aunt Mara? Only if it feels right. What if nothing feels right yet? Then Mara is enough. He walked toward his room and left the door open. I left the hallway light on. A year passed before life began to feel ordinary again. Not the old ordinary. That version depended on people pretending. Owen returned to school with a medical safety plan. He never went back to football. For months, he looked away whenever we passed the field. I did not tell him the loss would make him stronger. He had already heard enough adults use comforting words to avoid uncomfortable truths. He eventually joined the sports media team and discovered he was good behind a camera. He knew where to point the lens before the important play happened. Therapy helped him separate love from responsibility. He began supervised visits with Grant after 4 months. At first, Grant apologized in ways that required Owen to reassure him. The therapist stopped the conversation whenever it happened. Slowly, Grant began to understand that remorse was something he had to carry without placing it back in Owen's hands. Their relationship remains complicated. It belongs to them now. Vivian violated the no-contact order by sending Owen a letter through a cousin. She blamed me, the doctors, the court, and even Lydia for leaving confusing information. Owen did not answer. Her contact was suspended for another year. The financial investigation confirmed that Grant had forged the trust requests. He accepted a plea agreement requiring restitution, probation, and financial monitoring. His employer dismissed him after reviewing the false invoices. Vivian returned the money she received. Some relatives said the dispute should have stayed private. In families like ours, private often means that the person harmed is expected to remain quiet so everyone else can remain comfortable. The divorce became final, 11 months after the hearing. I kept the house because it was Owen's home. I also took my medals out of the cedar box and placed them on a shelf in the study. I was finished hiding the parts of myself that other people found inconvenient. Owen turned 16 in April. We celebrated with pizza, 6 friends, and a camera he had saved for. Grant attended for 1 supervised hour. Vivian did not. After everyone left, Owen carried 2 plates into the kitchen. When people at school ask who you are, what should I say? What feels true? My guardian sounds like court. It is accurate. My aunt sounds like someone I see twice a year. It does not have to. He looked toward the photograph of Lydia on the bookshelf. I don't want to call you Mom. It feels like I'm replacing her. You never have to. What did she call you? Mara. No. When she talked about you, I remembered Lydia standing in our kitchen, laughing with one hand over her mouth. She called me the person she trusted in an emergency. Owen nodded. That sounds right. He carried the plates toward the sink, then stopped. I think I'll tell people you're my person. I could not answer immediately, so I nodded. The judge's ruling did not heal us. Healing came later, in quieter moments. A bedroom door left open. Medication taken without an argument. A visit with Grant that ended without Owen believing he had to repair the adults around him. A birthday photograph where no one placed me at the edge. For years, Vivian used the word aunt as though it described a limitation. I no longer hear it that way. There is nothing small about being the person who stays. Justice did not restore everything we lost. It gave us enough safety to stop losing more. And in the end, Grant's story did not collapse because one perfect document appeared. It collapsed because every explanation required Owen to carry another lie. Who failed Owen more? Grant, Vivian, or both of them equally? Tell me which one you chose, and why. Because family is not always the person who claims the strongest title. Sometimes it is the person who notices, stays, and tells you the truth even when the truth changes everything.